These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Freedom Summer, Fascist Winter, with Felicia Denaud and Josh Myers. Africa World Now Project is next. In the concluding speech before the 7th World Congress of the Communist International in 1935, titled Unity of the Working Class Against Fascism, it was asserted that no general characterization of fascism, however correct in itself, can relieve us of the need to study and take into account the special features of the development of fascism and the various forms of fascist dictatorship in the individual countries. It is necessary in each country to investigate, study, and ascertain the national distinctive ties, the specific national features of fascism, and to map out accordingly effective methods and forms of struggle against fascism. 1935. The relationship between black socio-political thought and anti-fascism has a long history and multiple points of continuity. In October 1896, Ethiopian troops defeated Eritrean Italian forces attempting to turn Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, into an Italian protectorate. This defeat represented the first time since the Haitian Revolution of 1804 that a black nation had defeated a European power set to cannibalizing its independence. In that same year, the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson legally enshrined separate but equal conditions in the American South, ruling that interstate train cars could be separated by race. The decision formally launched the brutal U.S. racist system of segregation known as Jim Crow, and swung open even wider the door for terrors and lynchings that had inflamed the South with the collapse of federal Reconstruction of 1877. It can be argued that these two world historical events contributed to institutionalizing the black anti-fascist tradition. The memories of European aggression against the African homeland and the brutalizing experiences of black Americans in the United States converged. Langston Hughes spun this history into poetry when he declared that the fascists were, quote, Jim Crow peoples. What he is signifying is what black people understood about fascism. That is, what others did not. It was a sequel to the immiserations of Africans in the diaspora under capitalist modernity, offering them incipient awareness of Aimé Césaire's notion that fascism was the political violence of the white Western world come home to roost. In their writing and correspondence, Angela Davis and George Jackson identified the U.S. state as the site for a reemergence or indeed a perfecting of certain features of historical fascisms. Much of their thinking is immersed by explorations into the nature of monopoly capital, imperialism, and the inherent crises in capitalism. For Jackson, it was necessary to revisit the classical historiography on fascism, specifically highlighting the prism of race, the relationship between racial domination and capitalism, pinpointing the nexus of fascism and democracy, and the way it interrogates and displaces the normative conviction regarding the absolute antithesis between fascist rule and liberal democracy. In short, there is no separation between the fundamental parameters of liberal democracy and fascist rule. They produce and reproduce each other consistently. Jackson is profoundly aware of the variations of the forms of domination with historical fascism, but his perspective is affirmed through the vantage point from within a prison carceral system that could accurately be described as a racial state of terror. Moreover, it can be argued that his perspective can be seen to convey and recode that foundational gesture of anti-racist and black radical anti-fascism in Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism when he asserts that, quote, and one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy. The prisons are full. The torturers stand around the racks, invent, refine, and discuss. End quote. But the new American fascism that Jackson delineated is not an unwanted return from, quote, the other scene of colonial violence. It originates from the very center of liberal democracy itself. Prisons are full indeed, and rather than a boomerang effect, the normalization of racialized terror and war, which is one of the foremost ingredients of this multiracial fascism, or as Dhoruba bin Wahad calls it, democratic fascism, is much less dramatic or a sudden process of seepage, but a clear reflection of the permeation of the social space of actually existing within liberal democracy, with models and devices invented, refined, and discussed amid the, quote, concrete and steel. But it must not be lost that this notion of, quote, concrete and steel must not be seen as only the materiality of the prison itself, but as being fundamental to capitalist logic and violence beyond the prison. El Haj Malik Shabazz adds sharp clarity to this notion.
When I was in prison, I read an article, and don't be shocked when I say I was in prison. You still in prison. That's what America means, prison.
Simply put, the carceral realities legislated, adjudicated, and enforced are inherent in capitalist logic that is mythologized as democracy. George Jackson stressed the necessity to grasp fascism not as a static form but as a process, profoundly inflected by its political and economic contexts and conjunctures. In relation to this, he posits the point that, quote, trying to analyze a movement outside of its process and its sequential relationships produces theoretical and practical deficiencies. Uncontextualized analysis offers you, quote, a discolored glimpse of a dead past. Now, while for Jackson, fascism is profoundly linked to a restructuring of the capitalist state, it is also fundamentally a counter-revolutionary form, revealed by the violences with which it represses anything that poses a consequential threat to the capitalist state. For Jackson, fascism does not react immediately against an ascendant revolutionary force. It is a kind of delayed counter-revolution, parasitic on the weakness or defeat of the anti-capitalist left. Jackson writes, fascism must be seen as an episodically logical stage in the socio-economic development of capitalism in a state of crises. It is the result of a revolutionary thrust that was weak and miscarried. It is, indeed, a consciousness that was compromised. Viewed from this vantage point, compromise is necessarily entangled with the persistent pattern of the racialization of class that defines American history ever since the white supremacist counter-revolution against Black Reconstruction, or indeed ever since Bacon's Rebellion and the, quote, invention of the white race, as presented in Theodore Allen's Volume 1, The Invention of the White Race, Racial Oppression and Social Control, and Volume 2, Invention of the White Race, The Origin of Racial Oppression in Anglo-America. As Jackson highlights, Marx's definition of history as a broken, twisted sword spectrum of class struggles is substantiated by American labor history. What this unmasks is that fascism in the United States is a kind of perfected form for Jackson, all the more insidiously hegemonic because of the marriage of monopoly capital to the racialized trappings of liberal democracy. As Jackson declared, quote, fascism has established itself in the most disguised and efficient manner in this country. It feels so secure that the leaders allow us the luxury of faint protest. Take protest too far, however, and they will show you their other face. Doors will be kicked down in the night, and machine gun fire and buckshot will become the medium of exchange. This insight is not any more clear than in this very moment. Notwithstanding the national and conjunctural mutability of fascism, Jackson provocatively claimed that economic reform could be identified as a, quote, working definition of fascist motive forces, and one that was particularly apt for the political manifestations of U.S. monopoly capital. Jackson's analysis is a sharp application of Herbert Marcuse's postulation that the possibility of fascism in the U.S. is deeply entangled with the concrete forms taken by preventive counter-revolution as a core strategic imperative of the capitalist order. Stated more clearly, Marcuse writes, The question is whether fascism is taking or taken over in the United States. If by that we understand the gradual or rapid abolition of the remnants of the constitutional state, the organization of paramilitary troops, and granting to police extraordinary legal powers such as the notorious no-knock law, which does away with inviolability of the home, if one looks at the court decisions of recent years, if one knows that special troops, so-called counterinsurgency corps, are being trained in the United States for possible civil war, if one looks at the almost direct censorship of the press, television, and radio, then as far as I'm concerned, one can speak with complete justification of an incipient fascism. American fascism will probably be the first which comes to power by democratic means and with democratic support. July 1976. What is the specific relationship we might trace between the fascism problematic on one hand and earlier theorizations of fascism by black radical intellectuals on the other? In a 1990 lecture, Cedric Robinson advanced the proposition that chronic neglect of autonomous traditions of black radical theorizing has impeded engagement with the, quote, black construction of fascism that is alternative, indeed antithetical, to a euphonious recital of anemic definitions of fascism in mainstream theorization of the phenomenon. In this speech, Robinson goes on to survey the platitudes and incoherences of contemporary academic analysis of fascism to reveal a founding conceit or forgery, namely, quote, historical manufacture of fascism as a negation of the Western Geist, where the fascist nemesis confirms the essential superiority of Western liberalism, confirming the, quote, philosophic identity between Western civilization and Western culture as human destiny. Conversely, from the perspective of non-Western peoples and black radical movements, as Aimé Césaire had crystallized in Discourse on Colonialism, fascism, quote, was no more a historical aberration than colonialism, the slave trade, and slavery. Fascism was and is a modern social discipline of domination, which, much like its genetic predecessors, specific articulations of Christianity, imperialism, nationalism, sexism, and racism, provided the means for the ascent to and preservation of power for elitists. For Robinson, as was W.E.B. Du Bois, who affirmed, quote, the cultural identity between fascism and presumed democracies, anticipating Césaire in his assertion that, quote, the precondition for fascism was a civilization profoundly traumatized by slavery and racism. Later in 1915, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, quote, in a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. By this, Du Bois was referring to World War I, then raging across Europe. But it cannot be lost that his carefully chosen phrase, overturning of civilization, also indexed what Albert Memmi calls the, quote, fascist temptation, represented by the war itself. Yet it was Du Bois's attention to the means of African conquest that spoke most directly to his prediction about the shape, quote, not only of war today, but the menace of wars tomorrow. Du Bois writes, the methods by which this continent has been stolen have been contemptible and dishonest beyond expression. Lying treaties, rivers of rum, murder, assassination, mutilation, rape, and torture have marked the progress of the Englishman, German, Frenchman, and Belgian on the Dark Continent. It is with this cursory framework that we posit, echoing Cedric Robinson's postulation, quote, black radical perspectives on authoritarian politics contributes to overcoming the methodological conceit that has led to project typology onto history, treating liberalism, social democracy, neoliberalism, and indeed fascism itself as political orders that can be exhaustively defined and recognized as interdependently operative across particular times and spaces. Nevertheless, such an approach to the study of fascism can also contribute to breaking the repetition compulsion that underlines the debate on whether the present can be captured critically by analogy or comparison with European interwar fascism. In short, George Jackson's position that, quote, fascism is defined as a set of repressive tactics, as well as an encompassing political and ideological process, which differentially targets racialized and subaltern populations whose very existence and sociality is increasingly perceived as a threat, as evidenced by the porous borders between the quote criminal and the quote political prisoner. It is a process in which, as characterized by Jackson's notion of the repressive contract underlying U.S. capitalism, the accrual contempt for the oppressed is a fundamental survival technique. In short, fascism is already here. Today, we present a conversation we had with Felicia Denaud and Josh Myers, where we explore Freedom Summer, Fascist Winter. Felicia Denaud is a writer, poet, and professor of Africana Studies at the University of Cincinnati. She writes in the words of Sylvia Wynter toward the ends of empire, war, and accumulation by elimination. Josh Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. A central thread that guides all of his work is an approach to knowledge that takes seriously that peoples of African descent possess a deep sense of reality. A thought tradition that more than merely interprets what is around us, but can transform and renew these spaces we inhabit, a world we would like to fundamentally change. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly.
In that way, just got in town.
Thank you both for taking the time to join us today for a robust, deep conversation and range and scope on a project that you've just created. The title of the program is Freedom Summer, Fascist Winter, correct?
Yes, it is. Black Power, 1960 to 1970.
Perfect. So let's get right into it. Let's not beat around the bush. This is a moment that we should not have a lot of pomp and circumstances when we're engaging in, discourses around the moment, but also being sure that this moment is a part of multiple moments before. So let's talk a little bit about this project. Josh, we'll move in and out of like an organic conversation. So Freedom Summer, Fascist Winter. What is it? How did you develop it? And what are some of the basic tenets or ideas that you're engaged with?
Well, first, my gratitude for this invitation, Josh, for thinking of me and for believing that this framework has something to offer. Two times I've come across the idea of a political paradigm or a political framework being the essence of what a political theorist on the ground should be doing. So C.L.R. James said, all ideas are presented through a particular framework, and then yada, yada, yada. And then, Kwame Ture in Black Power, The Politics of Liberation in America, also says this is a framework. It's not a set of organizing solutions. It has an agenda of raising consciousness, learning how to ask a particular set of questions, etc. So I began dwelling on what kind of framework is necessary at the moment of Trump's inauguration. I'm living in a place, I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and my campus has a particular mood, which to me is really acquiescence from the leadership down. And I hope they hear this. Quite frankly, they've stated it themselves. So I'm just repeating what they've said, that the position, and there's a lot of, maybe we can get into it because this all connects to how I came up with the framework and thinking from the ground that 2 feet are on. I'm relatively new to Ohio. So thinking with and from Southern Ohio is a new political practice for me. But wherever I go, that's my priority. I try to bend my work to my location and bend my location to my work. So there's a lot of hostile, pretty aggressive right-wing legislation flying through every level of governance here in Ohio. And the university administrators collectively decided to be neutral. And that's their stated position. Whereas years past, maybe 2 years ago, they were a little bit more aggressive in saying, okay, we're not going to let this hostile right-wing takeover of public education happen. This time around, they've decided to comply in a kind of anticipatory compliance. And so I felt like we needed a mood shift, or at least for the people to create a new center of gravity, because there was a kind of sluggishness taking over. Now, Josh and I work on SNCC the SNCC Legacy Project or the history of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, its practice, and thinking about it publicly with former SNCC members. And in that, which is truly, I've said this, I know Josh is like, okay, she says this all the time, but that is really one of the highlights of my intellectual career, because SNCC is quite absented from the conversation of Black power. But when I started speaking to the SNCC veterans, and I realized the extent to which Freedom Summer is this mood shift. It's an organizational shift, but it's a shift in mood, it's a shift in attitude. And it anticipates, I think, 1966, which is where we really get that historiographical, like, okay, Black power is in gestation or it's here. I like to come back to Freedom Summer a little bit to think about, immediate roots, because we could go to the 50s, we can do this whole kind of play. And I actually encourage that, playing with periodization and causality. I think this is very important for Black people. When Douglas says, sorry, now I'm going to go like, when Douglas says, why am I a slave? To me, that's the beginning of New World thought. And it asks you to think about causality in a way that's very distinct from the disciplines, sociology, political science, physics, whatever. We all have a causal theory. Now, the weight of causality hits Black people in a very particular way, because it involves self-concept and structural understanding and all of that weird ground in between. I like to reorient people's attention to Freedom Summer as this organizational spree where there was massive institution building. There was a kind of reckless courage. There was this invasion of the South, that they called it, to me, which is this, like, when you look at the map, it is literally reopening the wounds of the Civil War. The way the lines trace down, it's quite beautiful. And it's the SNCC veterans who alerted me to the centrality of the Freedom Rides, which are 61, but then Freedom Summer, which builds on all of that momentum. And so Freedom Summer to me is understudied, underappreciated, maybe misrecognized because of the way it's been incorporated into dominant understandings of the civil rights movement. And so I thought, okay, Freedom Summer, and we're in a winter, literally and politically. This is cold, this is nasty, this is dark, this is real. I think this is something we haven't seen before. And so I like to also play with like earth metaphors. I do a lot on light, seasons. I think it brings out a different freshness in our thinking, a kind of organic relationship to seasonality. I mean, things come, they go, repression intensifies, and then we revolt. We just had 2020, which was a miraculous convergence of like, people and ideas and willpower that they spent the past 4 years dismantling, suffocating, or 5 years now, taking it right from underneath us. From, the way we reconceptualize what we're owed by the government through COVID, and now how somehow the right has recaptured that shrinking of government and returning the money to the people. That was our conversation during COVID. That was our time to say, you see what they can provide. You see what you deserve. You see what they've taken from us. But somehow we know that they intentionally have sort of grifted from our analyses and repurposed them quite effectively. So I was in search of a framework that would bring us to the revolutionary pieces of the 20th century that would make sense, and I think not undermine people's sense of dread. So that's where the fascist winter is coming from. We should feel the way we're feeling, but also as this kind of reminder that there's some kind of dialectical process, this call and response, whatever kind of historiographical or historical method you want to use, we're in process. It is a process. And being reminded that we have plenty of resources to understand what's happening, but also to forge a new way out was very important to me. So maybe I'll stop there for now. But
no, I think that you hit on a number of particular points. I'm thinking also the continuity of the nexus between forms of study, particularly Black studies. You're looking at the idea of the praxis of SNCC, the praxis of public scholarship and having public conversations and discourses and counter discourses. You talked about Black power. You talked about the periodization. You talked about 1968 institution building, the spontaneity of movements, particularly itself. And so this notion of a framework, I think, becomes very important in this moment when we're thinking about responses and reactions to the fascist tendencies that are from the top. But again, this is a very important, I think, framework to pay attention to the fascist tendencies that are driving at the local level, right? So when we think about the notion of the winter, we think about the notion of a freedom summer, it's this contradiction or a conflictual type of relationship, the dialectical processes. Talk a little bit more about your thinking in the context of SNCC, talking with the veterans, having an understanding, but also really thinking about this framework in this nexus of Black studies in this moment, the role of the university in propagating or promoting this fascist tendencies, because we are all in a moment right now that I think that we should not ignore, particularly us as professors or in classroom spaces. I mean, you can respond to anything there. And Josh, please, by all means, jump in here as well. But please, respond to any, just jump in. I just want us to really unpack this because there's a lot to unpack and then put back together.
Yeah. I think I'll start from Cincinnati because there's some very interesting stuff going on here. And I think it has reached a national spotlight, which always intrigues me, like that scaling. So there are a couple of things. I think Ohio itself is this clearinghouse for right-wing, like, kingmaking. You see J.D. Vance had to come through the political infrastructure. I mean, this man's going to come after me because I'm constantly talking about him, but he had to come through the Ohio political machine in a particular way that now Vivek Ramaswamy is trying to replicate. And so to me, there's something about Ohio's place as a right-wing machine that creates national presence that's very important. And what they're trying to do is restructure education from the bottom up to feed into this like nationalist, white supremacist nationalist project that they're after. And so while other states are thinking different points of process in relation to that larger project, Ohio is really streamlining it quite effectively. Ohio has one of the biggest like white supremacist homeschooling networks. And then, like I said, it's captured from top to bottom by the right, and they're being aggressive in a very particular way. So I think like February 9th or something, some Nazis, and I'm like, we can talk about how I hate that that's the ultimate and absolute reference for white supremacist terror, because we have our own domestic reference. And that does something. That's a part of a kind of psychological conditioning to interpret where white supremacy comes from. But anyways, they had the swastikas and they went on this overpass in a Black neighborhood. But it's not just a Black neighborhood. It's called Lincoln Heights. And it's the first self-governing African-American community north of the Mason-Dixon line, which is also this, I don't know, these are all kind of provisional things. But so there's a history of Black self-governance in Lincoln Heights. And it's related to trying to prevent Black people from acquiring land in Cincinnati itself, to labor for the local sort of industries, of which there are many here, to sequester that labor in a particular way without municipal services. I think this is very important. So without fire provision, firefighters, police, etc. So Lincoln Heights has this very, unique history of autonomy. And autonomy is one of my key words when we're thinking about Black power and the evolution from Southern freedom movement to a Black power paradigm, which are not mutually exclusive, right? These are deeply connected. And in the words of Brandon Terry, who I love, there's not this bad 60s, good 60s binary. That's also a disciplining fiction. But autonomy is one of the key words I try to drive when we're thinking about a Black power politic. So Lincoln Heights, these, Nazis go and they're like waving their things and the community rolls out like aggressively. They take the flags, they stomp them out, they're ready. And then there's a culture of being armed here. Anyone can go and get a gun, of which many Black people are armed and they know how to use weapons. So this became like a prideful moment on the internet. And you're seeing the local folks like, Hitler's dead. This isn't the 40s. Get out of here. You know, these images and this video is circulating around the internet. And it graduates over the past couple of weeks to the point now you have checkpoints. The community has created checkpoints. And you're seeing young men and women on corners with long rifles stopping cars that come through. To the point now where they've stopped property owners or like business owners. And now there's a kind of a backlash. So to me, my whole seminar, Freedom Summer, Fascist Winter, is irrelevant in the context, or not irrelevant, but that's the moment. And I'm like, my job as a professor here in Cincinnati is to actually invite these people to come and talk to us about militant self-defense. There is an organic, and there's also this intellectual conversation they're putting on the table. They brought us to the 40s in their videos, celebrating getting these Nazis out. They put Hitler on the table. It was brilliant because it was this praxis and this intellectual thing hitting a moment where we see Dems in disarray. I mean, they've been in disarray, but truly their impotence and their lack of will, or perhaps rather their willful collusion, is on full display. And it's breaking brains. It's breaking democratic brains. And then you have this community that is in this organic evolution around self-defense. And this is what Ella Baker said. Simply, strong people don't need strong leaders. They don't need Felicia's making seminars. They've got it. And so I can move out of the way and figure out, how do I shore this up? How do I intensify it? How do I amplify it? You know, so when they said Hitler's dead, I'm like, but Césaire said he isn't. And maybe this is a point of connection and we can really start to explode this conversation. And, you know, I started thinking around, okay, what does my seminar become in the context of this local self-organization where everything I'm babbling about, which I do think the babbling matters. I think the framework matters because I do think it's a moment they've opened a door where we can push that question of Césaire's analysis and discourse on colonialism, of the Hitler and all of you kind of thing, or what the 40s really mean, or what we mean by fashion versus what a historian of the 30s and 40s means, you know, whatever it is. And I keep saying 40s, you know, 30s, 40s. The Cincinnati Enquirer just did this article about how larger Cincinnati is becoming like very concerned about this spilling into militia, into a kind of militia. And I'm like, how funny. The fact that the community comes out of the deprivation of municipal services, a refusal to incorporate. And then they took that refusal and they made such an enduring, you know, community legacy. I mean, this to me is it. And I always say the people that will open the revolutionary door are never the people you're going to expect. I never thought Cincinnati used to come, you know, I first got here, I was like, oh man, geez, this place scares me a little bit. The deep white supremacy of Ohio, it's like Midwestern characters, like frightening to me in a unique way. And then all of these things are starting to connect. And not that they need to, but that's always how revolutionary moments happen. You don't know where it's going to come from. I say that to say that that's Six's message, that people will do it. Where will you be? Who will you be? In the context of people doing things that matter. And I can't say that I've risen to the occasion just yet. I haven't been in contact with the right people to make the right kinds of collaborations happen. But I would love to be irrelevant. I would love to sit back and watch, not sit back, to join in other ways other than my seminars. And they inspired me to think about, okay, what does self-defense for myself look like? What do you need to know right now? What would be irresponsible not to know? And I'm learning from they're young people. There are certain things you got to know. You can't just, when you say Black power, there are actually certain technical skills you should have. And so this has been, and then, you know, the right, I always do this kind of surveillance, watching the white supremacists online. So the local ones were like, oh, this was a win for us. It's a recruiting moment. We made national attention. You know, they're kind of trying to revise like how they look, because they look like just terribly organized and like vile like they are. But I'm like, okay, I have to be able to do more than that. And so it was a real wake up call to myself that history, like Fanon says, it will call you. Very few of us answer in the way that we know we're capable of. And so I think that all of the SNCC folks answered. They left the Cornells and the schooling, and they went to the front line that they identified. There's a refusal, there's a kind of sacrificial posture. I don't think there's any kind of meaningful political activity without sacrifice. Now that gets defined differently depending on who and what you are. SNCC has trained me to look for this self-organizing and this posture of self-defense, and to be able to read a historical moment or a social moment, whatever it is. So I think Cincinnati is this beautiful example of how people are. It's also about the climate. I mean, Nazis go out and do this stuff all the time, but there was a sensibility like not here. And you feel it when you see the video of the community, like literally like hungry rolling out. You're like, oh. So when I went to this talk with Daruba bin Wahad on Friday, and he was like, it is the best of times, it's the worst of times. And he's like, this is a great time for revolutionaries, which is so counter to what you're hearing. And he's like, those are not that we want more suffering. We don't want that. But we understand that we can read a moment, we can open a moment. And if we choose to look at it that way, then these are the best of times for those who are willing to suffer on purpose. And so I'm like, okay, there's this thing, this organic thing happening where people are emotionally, psychologically, but materially responding without leadership. They are being leaders, and not in the like BLM leaderful way. There's a real defense of land, of space, of who we are, of not here, not now. And I think like we need to practice that. I was at the State House, trying to do some testimony on this education legislation, and I brought in posters, and people ran over to me. They're like, "You're not supposed to have those in here." I'm like, and they didn't stop me. So if we can't even bring a poster in, I'm not sure we're ready. I don't know, from the little basic refusals to like maximizing, our refusal. We have to get in the habit of disobedience, of, whatever it is, not here, not now, not with me, I'm the wrong one, that kind of lesson. And so Nick kicks off the domestic 60s, because 1960s is a beautiful year of independence, of African independence, right? So it's cohering with a global moment, but 1960 is when SNCC is founded. And so that's why that decade is 1960 to 1970. I have a little thesis about the movement of Black organizations across the decade that I'm trying to explore. But so SNCC is helping me, or helps me continually read these moments and read for this kind of leadership. And then how my goal is to study it, or my job is to study it and then redeliver it in ways that people need. And I hope I can find other roles to play, but that, is what I do for now. And this has been such an awesome, organic, and scary, because there's going to be retribution. There has been. Apparently they came back, they're smashing car windows. They're lurking. They chose that community for a reason. And they say as much on their little platforms. So this is not without consequence. This is also, the police are on alert and angry about the Black sort of self-defense going on, and for being called out for defending the white supremacists and being on camera doing so. There are all sorts of forces that will be arrayed against Lincoln Heights. And we can celebrate on the internet, and then everyone will disappear while these people are still on the blocks doing checkpoints and figuring out how do we organically defend what we've created, which was, to use Gilmore's words, organized abandonment. This is the example of organized abandonment. But that also gives space for a kind of autonomy. And I wonder if we're at those flipping points where the abandoned places become places for a new kind of thing.
Yeah, please, Josh. Come, I mean, because this notion of refusal, the notion of these spaces and the abandonment, and we're seeing things fall apart in front of us, and what can come up from that, what can spring up from those fractures, what can spring up from those particular moments. Please jump in, Josh.
Yeah, we've never not had to do this. I think that's
Right.
really critical. The problem, of course, is we don't have a historiography of our never not having to do things like this because most of our historians are liberals. And so
Mm.
the frame of, liberal historiography when it comes to our movements is how do we acquire rights, right?
Mm.
It's not how did we acquire autonomy or why did we require autonomy? And
Mm.
so I think that part of it is a recognition of the ways in which academics in particular are tied to the kind of liberal tradition that's, somehow deeply American and also somehow totally inadequate for addressing fascism,
Mm.
and how the same forces that Felicia is talking about that emerged in a place like Lincoln Town have always emerged wherever Black people were. I think it's Robin Kelly who said that, this marriage is the first principle of African resistance. It's the first thing that we did. I also think about, you mentioned Ruthie Gilmore, one of her students, one of her PhD students, who's now a professor, Celeste Winston, has written
Mm.
about this here in Montgomery County, Maryland. Seven maroon cities or towns, like, existed well into the 20th century. In her book, How to Lose the Hounds. And so this frame is really important of exposing not only the Black liberal tradition and its failures in the face of anti-fascism, or its failures in the face of fascism, but also how there is a maroon tradition, an autonomous tradition that actually succeeds in framing anti-fascist approach that really hasn't been historicized. Almost everywhere that I've spoken in the last couple years, I tell the story of these Black World War II veterans who, of course, are also the elders that SNCC encounters when they get into the South. It's folks who had been through that war and had acquired the skills, military training strategy, right? How to use a gun. And they are now using those to tell SNCC, like, this is what we got to do to defend our space. It's not a question of nonviolence, it's a question of self-defense. And for them, I'm learning more about them in terms of their political orientation from, people like Nelson Peary, who was a World War II veteran. And, Spike Lee gets a glimpse of this in his film Miracle at St. Anna. And the way
Mm.
that Erica Edwards reads that film in her book, The Other Side of Terror, it's like these Black folk, some of them are actually joining the war as a means of self-determination. It's not the patriotic narrative of double V all the time. And so it's like, wait a minute, how does that work? Well, if you go into many parts of the South, whether it's, Louisiana, South Carolina, where some of these folks are leaving home and going into the war, they are trying to acquire the necessary training and skills to go back into their communities to defend, just as we had done in the wake of the Civil War in the late 1860s. Nelson Peary tells the story of how in one of his regiments, he had Black folks of from various locations, and they all had different ideas about the question of what the race should be doing. But none of them were basically patriots, right? And so there's one side that says we have to struggle for, self-determination. There's another saying is we got to get as much as we can get from the system as it exists, and so that we can redistribute what we can redistribute. And there's all of these different opinions, and what they were very clear on is that we have to destroy fascism, but not just the German fascism, but the fascism inside the U.S. Army. They were literally fighting a race war inside the military.
Yes,
That
yes,
was
yes,
not
yes.
metaphorical. In fact, Peary's unit gets into get a conflict with other U.S. soldiers, white U.S. soldiers, and as a punishment, they are sent to Louisiana, a place called Memmi, Louisiana, Many. Forgive me if you already heard this story, as I keep telling it, retelling it. When they get to Memmi, which is obviously, Jim Crow's the political order of the day, it was considered a punishment by the U.S. military. We're gonna send you into the deep South, and you're gonna teach you, go back to your racial etiquette, right?
Mm.
But when they get there, the Black community welcomes them almost as liberators. It's like, now we got military force behind our struggle. And it was like, for that time, the Black community was like good. There was no Jim Crow. There's no fear. There was no nothing except for Black self-determination. And so it's like that same energy obviously never leaves these soldiers. And like I said earlier, they're the ones who actually welcomed SNCC into the South and said, all right, let's do this. This is MZ Moore, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is E.W. Steptoe and so many others. And folks who are like, yeah, this is the work. Thank you. Finally, people are really coming to see that this is the space. Because there's a Black liberal tradition in Mississippi too, right? And so SNCC has, in many ways, to split that energy. And of course, they come on to the side of what they call the local people at the end of the day. And so what I'm saying is that there's a link between traditions of marriage, creating self-sustaining towns, and what eventually becomes the Black freedom struggle, which is not simply ever about rights. We have to get rid of that framework if we're ever
Yes.
going to understand what's happening. And that ability to see that, again, what does it mean for us to see ourselves as folks who are not asking for permission to be free, right? What does it mean for us to see ourselves as not having always to appeal to some other power? And I think that is an intellectual question. So we have to change how we write and study, but
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
also a shift in how we organize and teach.
Mm-hmm.
We should not be assuming that people don't have the capacity to free themselves, that they have to always appeal, that they always have to ask permission, that they always have to even protest. And so, with rare exception, historians don't necessarily frame our story that way. And even as they're getting rid of the history that is it's in the text, in the teaching, in the schools, we also have to recognize that history was always inadequate. And it has always been us who have told the story. And we have to empower, for those who are in the academy, we also have to empower our students with that knowledge so that they can realize that they don't have to be, quote unquote, formally credentialed in order to be a part of this. That they can go with the knowledge that we're giving them anywhere and help remind our communities like what we've always done and what we've always probably will have to do as long as this fascist structure and the liberal structure is in place. So thank you, Felicia, for framing this for us, because it is a question of framing. It is a question of orientation. Because if we don't do this, you know, the brands and the marketing folks, they're going to be the ones who get to tell us what our history is, right? And it becomes very interesting to juxtapose that to the ways that our kids, our young folks are receiving information. So I spent a lot of time just undoing what somebody heard on TikTok and social media, because it's glitzy, it's nice, it makes sense, but it's also not framed. And so it's not just about telling stories. We can do that, but it's also about resetting the frame and getting our young people better oriented to their actual legacy, their actual heritage, their actual tradition. I'm not going to use those kinds of words because there is that. It might not necessarily follow a pattern that you can identify easily through the empirical archive, but there is the tradition. And we know it because we feel it. We know it because we're a part of it. And that's what I've learned from working with movement folks, is that they do this not simply out of, a reading of the objective conditions. They do this because it's in their heart. And I think that that's what it took for so many of our ancestors to figure out what it is to do. They had to feel it first. They had to have a sensibility to it. They had to have a sensitivity to it. They had to have an orientation. And I think how we recreate that process is important because it's eternal. It's always going. And so we're not in the position of simply narrating it, but also entering it. And so I think that it's what I think about when I thought about, the series and the program and the framing that Felicia is giving us. It's like, what is always going on, and how do we enter that cycle?
That was powerful. Can I? Well, there's so many. Actually, do you want to?
This notion of and this framework, I wanted to talk about to tie everything together. We're talking about this idea of autonomy. And the framework becomes important, Felicia, because what happens is we have to pay attention to those structures of resistance that were already there, but also that are forming as well, right? In real time, in real motion. And so then when we're talking about how the way that we're looking, at remembering resistances before, at the same time, things are moving very rapidly. And there's all of these, the age of like social media, those type of things. So please, you can respond to Josh, but I just wanted to throw that there because I wanted to come back to this notion of autonomy and the structures and the systems and how do we understand or use frameworks and language that's not against the social motion of the people, but in line with what is being done. So that becomes essential as we are really trying to think with, at the same time, build, right? So.
I love the social motion of the people. That's a wonderful phrase. It's a wonderful turn of phrase. I'm always looking for motion. Probably my ADHD, but yeah. And that's why I loved this implicit dialectic in Freedom Summer, Fascist Winter, and being able to weather the deep repression, survive it, and building up a capacity to survive a loss. Because we're losing. There's also like no romanticism about, like I still will harp on this, how did we go from 2020 to 2025? What kind of social analysis, political and economic analysis do we need to go from burning precincts in Minneapolis and targets and, even if it's like captured abolition, something was in the ether. Some kind of analysis was being developed and touching people and driving people into action. And 25% of Black men are captured by the, Republicans and not like wagging our fingers. Is I will abandon nobody. That's what I had to say to my students when they were like, well, these people voted for, and these people voted. And like, if do you want Professor? You want Felicia? Felicia leaves no one behind. So our job is and Professor doesn't either. So I guess our job is to understand that space. But so social motion of the people, that's a social motion we have to be able to wrap our heads around is 2020 to 2025. I think that someone out there, one of you out there need to, I always say I'll do it, but obviously I'm not getting to it. We need a really thick analysis of each year. Because we have to study the right, because they're good at some things. They are. But I wanted to promote my own book in progress. That's terrible. But this is what I kind of presented at the seminar a little bit was this idea of war. This is what my work is on. And so I'm happy that Josh, and he has a much richer historical sensibility about these things than I do. I try to be as historically grounded as I can while being a person that plays with political ideas. But I always say I have a deference to the ground of history. I try to be as historically rigorous in my political theorizations as I can. But you have to, play a bit. But one thing that I've been trying to impress on people everywhere is this idea of the relationship between Blackness and warfare. And not just that we participate in the world wars of others, but how the very first and protracted forms of domestic and international warfare are on Native and Black people. And that we are disciplined out of the category of war, which is interstate property, conceptually, for a reason. And that our concepts hide as much as they give. So I've been making this claim for many years, to much critique. It's a right-wing talking point. I think race war is a real category of analysis. And when you move race and class, you shift them from like nouns that we're fighting over to like an adjectival thing about war, class and race war. It's refreshing. It gives space. It centers the antagonisms in different ways. And it, for me though, the race war needs to be more fully developed. So does class war, because people, I think, also have left that. They'll be like, I'm a Marxist, but there's no sense of what class war really is. So part of my work has been recovering a theory of race war for the 20th century, which I call Western fundamentalism. But to do that, I'm just listening. I'm listening, like Josh has this practice of listening to what people have said. And so this is like a little paragraph that I have, and these are all terms that come from our race. And so this slide, I sent you guys some of my slides, it's called The Red Record, which is from Ida B. Wells. And her, groundbreaking, like analysis of the causes of lynching, but also this groundbreaking approach to data, like the compilation, data visualization, like it's remarkable. I teach the Red Record on a unit on data in the early 20th century. And along with Du Bois, but we're troubling Du Bois is kind of how he has captured our sense of what data is and becoming the father of sociology. And somehow Ida B. Wells is not coming up in that conversation. I don't know why. But so the slide is called The Red Record, the fact of racial genocide. Now, the fact of racial genocide is a line from George Jackson in Blood in My Eye, which is the Black theory of fascism, where he says reform is fascism, period. To me, that was haunting and compelling. And once I read that, I never turned back. There's something deeply precocious and brave about the idea that reform is fascism. And it leads us away from the ground of history. Is fascism like liberalism in like trying to recover itself? Is it a corporate, militarized, all of those interesting debates that I think are necessary, but where and when they happen matter. And that's where I take up issue with like how people are taking up public space over the fascism debate. It needs to happen, but it can happen in your scholarly like specialization conversations. It doesn't need to take up oxygen and when we're trying to mobilize and it's like paralyzing people. But anyways, so the Red Record, the fact of racial genocide. So I call all of this Western fundamentalism because I'm like, this is not an extremism. This is about foundations. This is about the fundamentals of political liberalism. This is about the foundation of the West. So this is my shorthand, and it's a concept I'm really trying to use to understand the 20th century. So I say Western fundamentalism refers to the total ideo-historical groundwork, so the ideas in the history of what Ida B. Wells called the Red Record, what 19th century statesman and anthropologist Antonin Firmin, who was from Haiti, called, quote, international wars of extermination based on race. You see, that's what he was saying in the 19th century, because he had the political and social space in Haiti to do so. Brilliant. Firmin is truly brilliant, but he called these international wars of extermination based on race. What 20th century revolutionary prison intellectual George Jackson called the fact of racial genocide. What anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon identified as generalized homicide. What freedom fighter Dr. Martin Luther King deemed cultural homicide. What William Patterson, who went to the UN before them, called an undeniable, quote, record of mass slayings on the basis of race. And in a shared existential cadence, Adam Clayton Powell warned, we must move now under our own power or be exterminated. So I think to Josh's point about war figuring more than just double victory, liberating Europe, liberating us here, there's a real centuries-long preoccupation with the question of warfare. And I began to think about the Southern freedom movement and the Black Power paradigm. Obviously the Black Power paradigm puts war squarely on the table, but how do we begin to think about counter-war, to use Dr. Burton's term in his new book, as a foundational part of our like seeking autonomy or understanding autonomy or analyzing our own condition. And now we're in the midst of wars burning up everywhere. Like I began the seminar with Everywhere is War, the song, and In the Mississippi River by the SNCC Freedom Singers. Because we've already said this. We've warned humanity about institutionalized warfare. We've warned humanity about the war on civilians. That is what we are returning to in a systematized way. And we're struggling to develop an analysis around, well, why are civilians being slaughtered everywhere and anywhere? And I'm like, if we turn the frame again a little bit and we listen to SNCC, the US government declared war on the SNCC freedom fighters, quotes from Bloody Lounge, the documentary. I'm just always listening, and what I'm hearing is a centuries-long analysis of war, from slavery as social war forward. Humanity must reckon with war. Then it becomes our job to say, okay, so what's the difference between liberation war or people's war? And, then how do we start splicing and dividing self-defense or offensive maneuvers? Because those aren't off the table either, from state wars or wars of capital, wars of the patriarch, as they call them, colonial war. Then it becomes like the real business of, okay, what is revolutionary violence, all of these things. But when we listen, especially across the 60s, and we listen very closely, Vietnam is so essential to how we understand ourselves as freedom fighters, and we understand the world, obviously decolonization in Africa. War is so fundamental. And somehow, like, my project began when I'm like, how come we're not in war studies? I've always had this very weird obsession with military studies and war. For some reason, my first paper in high school that I really remember really enjoying was about Sherman's March to Sea. I don't know. That I was like, okay, we don't show up in this conversation. And obviously that's intentional. But to Josh's point, it's an incubator for so much. And so I think Black people are particularly primed right now to contribute to the international conversation about the war on life, on civilian life, but life itself. And how this is really a species, it's a species level issue. There's some deep reckoning that has to go on that we have been dealing with for so long, that we've been naming. I mean, I thought, wow, wars of extermination based on race. So then I started thinking, okay, David Harvey was like dispossession or accumulation by dispossession. I'm like, let's take that just a notch up, and it's dispossession by extermination. And I'm like, so the West seems to be trapped in this project of needing to exterminate to create. And the loop is getting tighter and tighter, and more people are getting trapped in it. And to me, that's like the glitch of the human sciences. And that's where my project tries to go, is like, you can't get out of this cycle of extermination and this really brilliant kind of, scientific contributions to life or knowledge that the West makes. Like, we're going to acknowledge you. You've made some great contributions, but your thinking is tied to a need to exterminate, and you can't get out of it, and you don't know how. You don't want to, perhaps, either. But so I'm interested in now, extermination is one of my key words, because, Adam Clayton Powell says that. Move now under your own power or risk being exterminated. So some people call these, the exaggeration of rhetoric. I'm like, no, these are analyses. Extermination is not just being disappeared totally. It's other kinds of aggression and loss. So I just really appreciate that, linking the folks that the St. Veterans had to understand and process, and how war is an incubator of a lot of our ideas and our sensibilities, and it's becoming more and more the human issue.
So I think that several things. First, I'm thinking about Western fundamentalism as a way of entering this conversation, it reminded me of two things. First, in order for something to be fundamentalist, you got to have fervent believers in it, and there's a kind of religious ecstasy that subtends fundamentalism. There's a
Yeah.
people experience that. And Cedric talks about this as charisma. Cedric Robinson talks about this as charisma, but it has the appearance of having the valence of salvation, and that produces an ecstatic reaction, which might help us better understand that even as it is irrational for so-called poor people, so-called dispossessed people to celebrate Western fundamentalism in the form of neo-Nazi movements or in the form of January 6th or in the form of the Proud Boys or whatever form it takes, even as it is irrational, that irrationality actually means something beyond just these people are silly or these people are, not quote unquote smart. And that's like the longer view of how, fascist movements actually work. And so fundamentalism is a really perfect term to use to speak towards that. Irrationality does not necessarily mean immaterial or inconsequential. It's just another part of how human beings move. And, you know, the solution to that probably is not more rationality. If you think about how things work together, because war is rational in a sense. And so,
Yes, it's the most rational, right?
yeah,
Like it's the most technical organization of violence, rules and like
yeah, but it needs the Nazis. It needs the irrational folk in order for it to work.
yes.
If you take away the sort of Western part of it, you bring up for men who I've written about actually, and
Uh-huh.
Haiti and how his his people, spirituality or the form of spiritual of Odun that was critical for the Haitian Revolution might also be read as irrational, but probably not fundamentalist because
At all. It's way too flexible.
it didn't need the sort of rigor or the, as you say, the inflexibility of a fundamentalist project. So how does it work? Becomes the question. How does it work without the fundamentalism? And how does it work through the irrationality? Because, in terms of military strategy, it doesn't make sense for somebody to cover their bodies with a cannon in order for, right? This notion
Right.
of, blocking the cannons with your body and knowing that it might, in terms of the rational strategy, lead to a better advance. But also, they believe that, yeah, I'm returning back to life
DNA.
through
Yeah.
that. This is not the end. I love the story of during the Haitian Revolution when the elder or the mother and three daughters are sent to the gallows, and one of those daughters is downtrodden, and the mother says, "Hold your head up! Don't you know how to die?" Like, what is this? What, as Erica Edwards
I
says
can
of
hear my
other,
mom saying that.
yeah, right. But what kind of tradition is this? And so it's not a counter to Western fundamentalism as such. It's not the opposite. And I think that is really important when we think about that frame, right? We're not flipping the script, and people like flipping the script for some reason. Shout out to Kendrick Lamar. Like, people like flipping the script, and they think and it's assumed to be radical. And the other thing that the evocation of fundamentalism made me think about was how it shows up in Jacob Carruthers' work to describe the Western, I want to say psyche, but that's not even it. It's how they view the whole order of the universe, right? And so he
Yeah, they're
uses fundamental,
cosmological. Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
he uses the words fundamental alienation. Their alienation from a more exacting and a more expansive conception of the universe is fundamental. And so that's why you get progress through extermination as an ethos, because they see
Yes.
themselves as alienated from what makes the universe go. And to me, these are like, Greg Carr calls them grand theorists. Jacob Russell was a grand theorist, meaning we're going to create a theory at the largest level, at the largest point of departure that we can find so that we can explain everything else. And I think that there is a hesitancy to do that in the modern academy. There's a hesitancy to try to do this sort of wide angle, to think through these large questions. And I think we have to get back to that. So your word, Felicia, is actually doing that, getting back to these more expansive explanations for the phenomenon that we're dealing with. Because, and James can talk about this too with Sylvia Winter. We are not just talking about a micro level conversation when we talk about something like the fascist turn, if you will. This is not just a turn. This is like a 600 year
life itself. Yeah.
Like they've been turning. The world is turning around fascism. And so I get so upset, when there is this attempt to poo-poo people who are saying that things are really, 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 really bad, more fundamentally bad than even your narrow intellectual project can help us understand, because it's not like a 1945 or 1935 or 1900 to now process that we're talking about, right? You can't compare, this moment of fascism to the Nazis and think that that's the only field of comparison that's possible. And I think that gets so many of us who are involved in these discourses out of whack and out of tune with actually what's happening. And so we need the larger angle. We need the wider angle. We need a better frame. And I think that this also coincides with, some of Cedric Robinson's work on anti-fascism that he wasn't able to publish in full.
Complete.
Because I think had that connection to the way that he re-narrates radicalism as the people, right, as the movements, as the ordinary folk, could also apply to the way that he was narrating anti-fascism as the people, as the ordinary folk. And then we might be better able to appreciate it's just Black living. That's the antidote. That's the it's whether you call it rationality, irrationality, whether you try to put it's just Black living. And I also hear Jerry Augusto in my ear, right? It's how we live. It's how you make life. It's how you, as we say back in the South, down in the South, make a way out of no way. That's the antidote. And I also hear Imani Perry. And it's also, and what she makes me think about is, you don't have to tell everybody what that is. Like, you don't have to share that to the world all the time. But that is the thing. That is the thing. So yeah.
Oh my. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm talking too much. I call this, because I was raised Catholic, and I take some of the structural things that I enjoy and I evacuate the content. The mystery of life. I always thought in church, I'm like, these are the mysteries of our, like that point, I'm like, okay, it's almost over. But then also, okay, the catechism relies on mystery. And I thought, what happened to mystery in secular knowledge? And so when I first gave a rendition of this seminar, it was named after my book at Brown University. It was for a weekend on the Pendleton 2. And these are brothers that are in Indiana that we consider political prisoners because they essentially saved another incarcerated, beloved, like older, one of the ones that ushers you into political consciousness and Lincoln love. And he was going to be murdered by these guards. So they take hostages to save him. No one dies. It's not adequate. No one dies, but they get severely punished. They're still incarcerated today. And to me, it was like that love under duress, that choice. They were in for something like, shoplifting or something like that, like minor, like things that are ridiculous, and end up getting like 100 years and then moved around and tortured and just like, and the defense committee and others like discovered through research, and this is why revolutionary research matters, that the guards in the particular, and everyone knows Indiana has a big Klan history, or should know, the guards were some offshoot of the Klan. And so that care, that capacity to like make a way inside under those conditions out of love and out of discipline, to me, that's the mystery of life. And I'm like, we can never be analytically detoured away from the being on this discovery of the mystery of life. That's as our human purpose, to me, is what being disciplined into like education gets rid of, is the wonder of mystery and the capacity to sit in the face of mystery or to enjoy mystery and the mysterious things that compel us. But to me, there's like, it's care that, and I think I called it, so like Western fundamentalism, abolition more, the mystery of life after master power. But it was the whole weekend was about the Pendleton too. And I hope it's okay if I read a poem, because I began all my classes with like music, poetry, short stories, photography. Like we do some kind of extended Warman. This is why all my classes are 3 hours long. But I think this poem by Wanda Coleman, to me, who is like, she's my favorite poet, because sometimes it's so hard to like find a poor poet, someone that's materially poor and stayed that way because the poetry establishment refused them. But they write from that place, spiritually full, materially poor. She like leaned into that in a way, and she has such a like spark and electricity in her writing that I love to introduce her to people. But there's the mystery of life, I think, is demonstrated in this poem. Everything that Josh was just talking about. It's kind of long, but I think, well, it's not long. It's actually good. I'm going to read it because it ends on this note, this alchemy that happens that's mysterious and comes out of really dire circumstances. But, okay. So it's called Things No One Knows. Overcome by the stink of mildewed wash, I have been 3 months behind in my rent for 30 years. My countrymen do not love me. Even my lines have blinds. We are getting old in a city where the old are invisible. I have nothing new to eat and barely 5 minutes to use the Jane, and less time then to revisit my father's grave. I've worn the same underwear for 15 of those 30 years, and some pieces longer than that. Writing friends is a luxury. Enemies, a necessity. My car was stripped and stolen months ago, and I have no money with which to repair or replace it. My mentors have exiled me to the outskirts of nappy literacy. My wallet is dying of militant brain cancer. My lust for my country is frigid. The light excludes me, and there is no degree for what is learned in the dark. I am too clumsy to steal big. There is a boogeyman in New York City who conspires against and spreads rumors about my lost lip. I am so economically crippled, even my begging cup has mold sprouting in its well. My son has mistaken me for a dragon, and his history teachers keep trying to hose out those flames in my mouth. I do not attend my high school class reunions because too many of my classmates died in Vietnam or in the liquor lockers of America or in those classrooms long ago. There is a boogie woman in Oberlin who conspires against me, her jealousy inspired by my imaginary imaginings. I am trapped in the hold of my greedy grief and expected to keep circling. I expect my son to escape and my husband to die during exquisite crisis. The Federal Bureau of Pajamas is after my hot crust buns. I expect to awaken from sleep soon. I expect my banana nut bread to go stale and uneaten. I expect to die poneless and to be cremated in state ovens. I expect my ashes to be scattered like pollen, to take wing on the wind like butterflies. And so I'm like the note on which it ends, from state ovens to ashes on wind, to me is that making a way of no way, the mystery of life, that je ne sais quoi, that thing that cannot be named, that feeling that you alluded to that precedes the political analysis or the political action. Like it is, I think it's exquisitely captured in those moments. And I'm really compelled in resurrecting this kind of a feeling in people. And so I don't know, just the poem, I started the seminar with it because there's a kind of feeling I think needs to be created before people can learn. And it's like the feeling just like opens the mind. It relaxes people. It disrupts the kind of things we walk into a classroom with. I love the line where she says people died, like the people that died in the classroom, because that's intentional. If they can't get us then, they get us on the workplace. But all the things that you alluded to is like how I begin the conversation. And so I thank you, and thank you for letting me read that.
No problem. I mean, this is a platform. This is not necessarily, it's not a structured like take turn. No, we want to, engage in thinking, as I like to say, black out loud. Josh, and this notion, and Felicia, this idea of Western fundamentalism, the connection between blackness and warfare. It's very interesting because I'm constantly thinking about, of course, in the context of Sylvia Wynter, this process of the continual extraction of the individual out of a collective context, which also has a continual violent process, which really meets, and I'm really thinking particularly about this wide angle. In order to actually have this wide angle, it also requires a inclusion of others. Western fundamentalism cannot do that. The idea of the creation of the human in a very minute context that, Josh mentioned this notion of rights, and we're constantly kind of battling this contradiction. And every time the imposition of a new form or a new thinking about what the individual is in whatever historical context, Black folk rebel against that. Black folk tend to kind of move at and say, no, we had structures, ancient structures, maroon structures that attempted to constantly create this blackness and warfare that you're thinking about. So as you were saying that, I was really thinking about, and then alienation, all of these particular things, because, when we're talking about Black studies as an anti-fascist, coming out of an anti-fascist tradition, it becomes very important to understand those contradictions and that warfare and that internal warfare of those who were in the academy itself and pushing against those theories, those forms of knowing that are forced upon us in be it graduate school and undergrad and elementary school. Hell, we can go down to preschool. You know what I mean? We can really understand that there's this constant process of Western fundamentalism is constantly redefining or trying to redefine, this idea that in the context of the human is at a very violent rate. And it's just ramping up in this particular moment. So anything you could jump in. I'm just kind of thinking about that because as Josh was talking and as you were kind of explaining and also looking at some of your work, it's very, very interesting that this framework that you're developing is really trying to get at multiple things at the same time. This idea of the individual, what does human life mean in the context of a capitalist system that is literally constantly falling in on itself.
No, that's power. It's a wonderful reminder too about this producing it takes a lot of psychic, intellectual, and material energy to produce the idea of the individual. And I was rereading Stuart Hall's like a piece on Marx, where that was basically, he was really emphasizing that that's one of Marx's great methodological insights is like, they present it as the basis when it's the arrival. It requires centuries of like violence to produce the idea of an individual. So I love that reminder because I do think it's funny, Josh, you said the grand theory because I was an undergrad in my like thesis seminar, I wasn't the best student. I mean, I was, but like, I was definitely distracted. But I did come in one day and I was like, no, I was a good student. Let me not play myself. But like, so I was like, Foucault, I want to do that. I want to write like this. Like, I want to write at this level because it doesn't seem like sociologists write like this. And they're like, no, you can't. No one can do this again. Like, and this is a direct, I never will forget that no one can do this again. And I always said, this is the only level that I can actually think of. Like, I wish I could think at different scales, but I really struggle. I can only see the big picture. That's why I love historians. And that's why I couldn't survive in history. I just can't think at the scale, the empirical scale that you need to be successful. And I do wish I could. So it's funny that you said like there's a need for it because I was told to my face, dead in my eyes, let go of that. That is not, we call these grand theorists. That's what this guy said. And we don't do it, especially sociologists. And I was like, okay, well, I got to get out of here then. So, but I wanted like, since you brought up Winter, I just want to read a few more things. I hope that's okay because it wraps all of this together. to Josh's point about the recurring, repetitive nature of this stuff, and then some of Winter's insights, it's quite short, but so I say Western fundamentalism runs on loop. Stranger fruit, fallen genes, more final solutions. That's all you get. And I really like that line. But I try to think with each of those categories. Stranger fruit, obviously we understand. Fallen genes coming from Winter, and then more final solutions is like the ongoing extermination process. These are the canonical outputs of world system warfare. And here the West will remain, bewitched and arrested by its wars of extermination, hanged by supply chains, quote, incapable, as Césaire announced years ago, 75 years ago, of solving the two major problems to which its existence has given rise. So, and that's basically race and class war. So the species struggle for me of the 21st century remains that anti-systemic reclamation of Earth and cosmos, like from the stars down to the subsoil, from Western fundamentalism's biophobic break. And I first encountered the word biophobia in National Geographic, I think. And it was this article about how like people are afraid of bugs, but like now it's becoming a very generalized fear of like other life. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's really powerful. That Western fundamentalism's biophobic break, it's irreversible disidentification with living matter, with terrestrial matters, with life on Earth as we know it, and more importantly, as it could be. The West's many and ongoing final solutions are confessions. What do they confess? The open secret of the human sciences is this bio or autophobia, the original fantasy of fallenness. Foucault observes, modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. Winter concludes, Western man is the first human being in the history of the world to totally inhabit a commodity culture. Humanism has ended in its negation. Men have become the objects they have created. Western man creates his being as a thing. And then the thingification wraps back around to Césaire. But so there's something in the individual that's at stake in each of those. Like, even though I bring it up to the cosmos, Winter and Foucault bring us down to like the thingification, the human object, like, you know. So, you know, to wrap all of those, like, I do think it's a cosmological issue in this, like, obviously the way Elon Musk is going, but, you know, I think that's my email. I'm so sorry. Stop emailing me. I'll stop there. But it's very interested in how do we stack the scales, and then how each of us, how we move across the scales and carry different resources as we do, you know, because what we say to fortify each other is a bit different than what I say in a public square, which is a little bit different, I'd say, on the world stage, which is a little bit different than, but there's some continuity that Black people like have understood and have been working through. And I'm like, I don't know, it feels like it all comes down to this. Like, we've been working on this moment for a very long time. And it's like, not in a savior way, to Josh's point, or a salvation, that it's like, been a protracted struggle. And all of the pieces seem to be coming together. And we have this very unique eye. I mean, I've been looking out into the world for more. And I've made connections with different people. I gave this presentation, right? And many students stayed after. It was 3 hours long, and like a handful of them stayed 2 extra hours. And there were people from Algeria, Pakistan, India, and we're sitting in a circle. And I'm like, I just listened to a podcast about Baluchistan, and the girl stood up immediately. And she's like, I've been in America for years. I've never heard anyone say where I'm from. And I was like, the podcast was about the incredible state terror Pakistan, you know, concentrates here, and the incredible, you know, work being done against state enforced disappearance. And it was about this particular activist who moves to Canada, and then she dies. But they're like, it's a suicide. But the question was it transnational terrorism from the state? And it was this moment of Black power does that. It brings these like incredible methods and forms of recognition. And then I've been following this Kurdish scholar that I adore, Nazan Ustendan. And so I see she has a book, so I get it immediately. I open it up. The first quote is from my advisor, Anthony Bogues. And then I'm reading, and everything is from Black political theorists, particularly Black women. And so I email her, and I'm like, I've loved your work, because there's an understanding that the Kurdish positionality as like the largest stateless group across the Middle East, and their relationship to war always made sense to me as like a resource to understand. And she's like, I feel the same way. You're the first Black person to like reach. She's like, I've been waiting for this moment, you know? And we have this incredible intellectual synergy. And so as these moments keep accumulating, I'm like, oh man, we are so dangerous. There is no part of this earth we don't touch with our ideas, with our presence. Like it was truly these moments in particular. What I love most is obviously to connect diasporically. And when that's like what I'm here for. And to be able to create theoretical paradigms that move across our conditions. That's what I'm actually looking for. But what I've realized in so doing is that it gives so many people an explanatory power, particularly against state violence. But like we have it. That's what the like little voice in the back of my mind. Like I had just heard the podcast maybe a week. I had never heard of Balochstan. I had never heard of I knew like Pakistan's kind of what was like little things that are going on over there. I try to be as alert to like everything as I can be, but it was her like the feeling in her eyes and the feeling that I felt when it's like, this is one thing. This is one deep human cry. And we have been at it for a long time, and it is time. Like that feeling has become more apparent. The more I do this presentation, the more I try to really develop the ideas out, and the more I talk to other people around the world. And yeah,
So as we kind of just take a pause, like I said, I'd never like to end, because I think everything is a continuous conversation, and we try to curate, and think about, this collective and think collectively as we begin to kind of just take a pause in this, because there are many different thoughts that have been popping up. We don't have a lot of time because I actually have to get ready to go in shortly. But Josh, did you have any comment specifically, or any closing thoughts or wrapping up thoughts in the moment?
What you just got finished talking about, I experienced in England. In fact, we rebroadcast my program in England on this podcast. But the sister who was the chair of the program, Pakistani, and she said that, of Black study, reading it for, the program actually helped her better understand what had been happening since October 7th. We were in England on October 20th. And so it gave her like a frame for thinking about what was happening, and something that I, should have known might have happened, but I was still kind of like, oh, really? Right? And I think about that in the context of the work that I'm doing around music. And that happens literally every day in terms of the mode of our musical tradition. And so
wow.
trying to bring those streams together, because everyone can see it in the music, and see how the music is only a reflection of something deeper than just, people playing some instruments. That human that you mentioned, or that sort of grounding, universalist, which we like to go away from sometimes, but that grounding universalist claim for freedom and liberation and autonomy and personhood in ways that don't necessarily like mirror.
Felicia, any thoughts? And as you're thinking about, you mentioned you're thinking about, as you're constantly giving this presentation, as you're refining your thoughts, and what is the next step in the context of what you're doing? Of course, you're working on your manuscript, you're working on, different projects. But again, this is not a pause, but this is a continuation. But what are some of your thoughts that you would love for folk to leave with as they're listening to this conversation, again, attempting to extract things that can be used and thought about in a continual process?
Well, I think I'll ask the question that I began the seminar with, which is, what time is it?
Mm.
And I got an array of answers. And to plug to Josh's point, some people brought me to the blues and music and time. But I think it's an urgent question. I'll hear a couple questions. What time is it? What is your North Star? I take that from Joy James. And this is a remix on Harold Cruz. But to whom does revolutionary initiative really belong?
Yeah.
Because all of these theories have this kind of staging of the revolutionary subject. And I think all of that, we have a whole new crop of people that will be suffering in a way that they've never experienced before. And some people find it amusing, like the people losing their jobs and like, oh, this is a professional managerial shakedown and it has nothing to do with the working poor. And I'm like, well, no, I'm looking at Haiti, I'm looking at Congo, I'm looking at Sudan, I'm looking around the world and I'm seeing massive levels of suffering. And the question is, to whom does revolutionary initiative really belong? Beyond the theories, beyond the established answers, we need a new sensibility of the we, to use Winter's formulation, the we referent. And that's the question I'm asking myself as I move forward. And I think I'll end, I guess Brandon Terry said, he likes to use problem space to define Black power. He takes that from David Scott. And problem space is a context of argument and intervention. And I really like that. Like, how are we going to define this problem and as a actionable thing? What kind of questions do we want to ask about it? What questions are worthy of our time? A lot of people are playing with our time because they are working on their time, their tenure clock, their this, their that, their self-concept, their ego time. I don't know what it is, but they're playing. War makes people and things, or like things that are self-consumed, very relevant very quickly. And that's why I heard a lot of people hush after October 7th, because the work couldn't meet the moment. And so I'm always thinking about, why am I speaking? Which maybe I should have been a little bit more mindful of how I spoke today, then what questions am I actually asking? And what does sacrifice look like right now? So what time is it? What's your North Star? And to whom does revolutionary initiative really belong? Because we've been kicking the can and we're hitting a wall at this point. And so I'm eager for people to answer. I'm eager to answer that myself with others. Thank you for the time.
No, thank you for that. And anytime you come here, there is no apologizing for taking up time, because we don't look at that. We do not look at it in that very have all the space that you want. No, thank you for taking the time to actually talk with, have this conversation, engage in it. I look forward to another iteration as we're really kind of thinking about this in real time, on the ground, in the classrooms, working in our working class communities as well. So again, thank you very much.
Traveling at the speed of light, and then at the same time I'm in the same spot too. Room was kept in about the same way you left it, but what about the twice the